Now, the International Court of Justice has ordered Russia to immediately halt its invasion in Ukraine. The United Nations top court has said that it is profoundly concerned by Moscow's use of force.
The Federation shall immediately suspend the military operations that it commenced on 24 February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine. The Russian Federation shall ensure that any military or irregular armed units which may be directed or supported by it, as well as any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control or direction, take no steps in furtherance of the military operations referred to in point 1 above.
Now, the Indian Justice Dalveer Bhandari voted against Russia. Justice Bhandari is a former judge of the Supreme Court of India. His vote against Russia comes as an independent move based on his own interpretation of the ongoing conflict. Interestingly, it does not represent India's official position on this war in Ukraine by the Russians. Remember, India has chosen not to take a stand in the ongoing crisis at the United Nations. It has abstained from voting, and it has called on both sides to prioritize negotiations to end the violence. Ukraine filed a case at the International Court of Justice on the 24th of February, shortly after Russia invaded into its territory. Ukraine has argued that Russia's justification that it is acting to prevent the genocide of people in eastern Ukraine is completely unfounded. During a hearing that was held earlier in the month, Ukraine said that there was no threat of any genocide in eastern Ukraine. Kiev has not only disputed the grounds for the invasion, it has also sought for emergency provisional measures against Russia. Now remember, the court's rulings are binding, but there is no way of enforcing the rulings of the court. A full hearing into the content of the case could, of course, take years to go by. According to experts, in some cases, these court rulings have been completely ignored by the powerful nations. Russia has said that it skipped the ICJ hearing in the wake of the absurdity of the lawsuit that has been brought against it.
Which may aggravate or extend the dispute before the court, and that the
All right, now to give us more insights in terms of what is happening in this conflict, we are joined in by our correspondent Giles Gibson, who is joining us live from Riga in Latvia. Giles, we just saw what's been happening at the World Court. The Ukrainians have, of course, appealed against this invasion by the Russians. But despite the international condemnation that Russia seems to be getting, it is not relenting in the attacks that it has carried out in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right. The Ukrainians brought this case at the ICJ just very quickly after Russian forces entered Ukrainian territory, arguing that there was no evidence that Russian forces were stopping some sort of a genocide taking place in eastern Ukraine. The Russian response to this was pretty interesting in the sense that they didn't even send any legal representation in person to any sort of a hearing at the ICJ. They said that they weren't going to do that because in light of the apparent absurdity of the lawsuit. They did, however, the Russian authorities send a letter to the ICJ claiming that they don't believe that the ICJ has any sort of jurisdiction over this, and saying that they had actually justified their attack to the Secretary General of the United Nations on grounds of self-defense, not that they were intervening to stop some sort of a genocide taking place in eastern Ukraine. Of course, as you were mentioning there, this is binding under international law, this ruling, but the ICJ in The Hague really has absolutely no way of forcing Vladimir Putin or the Russian defense minister to call troops back from where they are currently.
Now, in case of an adverse ruling in this case, is there anything at all which the Russians can, of course, do, or are they just rejecting the fact that the ICJ has no jurisdiction to, in fact, rule on this case?
Yeah, the Russians have just completely rejected the Ukrainian case. They have rejected the ICJ's jurisdiction here. And yeah, as I was saying, they've barely even sort of showed up for any sort of a hearing here. They've barely sort of engaged in this process. But clearly we are seeing from the Ukrainian side a warm welcome for this ruling from the ICJ, because they are looking for international allies. They're looking for more support. We've seen Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, calling for more arms, more support from NATO and other countries around the world. So this ruling at the ICJ, this message for Russia to withdraw its troops, will certainly help Volodymyr Zelensky and his foreign minister just attract more support and attract more allies in this conflict.
And also looking in terms of how the war is progressing inside Ukraine, we're getting a sense that the Russians are intensifying the attacks that they are carrying out. And on, parallel to that, there are negotiations that are also being held between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Is Russia at this point of time willing to in fact negotiate with the Ukrainians and settle this war?
Both parties shall refrain from any act.
All right, I think we seem to have lost my colleague Giles Gibson there, but this of course is what is happening at this point of time, where this case, the final verdict could of course take many years to come, and Kiev of course approached the World Court immediately in the aftermath of the Russian invasion into Ukraine, and the Indian judge present in the panel has of course voted against Russia. This, remember, does not indicate in any way India's official position on this war by the Russians in Ukraine. India at the United Nations has chosen to abstain from voting on this issue. This of course isolates Russia further. An adverse verdict, of course, by the International Court does not necessarily mean that the verdict can be in any way enforced by the World Court. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.